On the 6th of May, 2023, an old man in mourning dress took his seat inside Westminster Abbey and watched a woman he had once called his wife be crowned queen. He was 83 years old. He had married her half a century before, on a summer morning with the household cavalry lining the aisle, and he had lost her, slowly, to the man now lowering the crown onto her head. And yet he did not look away, and he did not speak. For 30 years the world had waited for Andrew Parker Bowles to tell his side, to sell the secret, to name the wound. He never did. The most famous wronged husband in Britain sat in silence and smiled. The question was why? If you are the kind of person who wants the truth behind the headline, the private cost behind the public spectacle, then subscribe and stay close. Because what happened to this quiet man was never meant to be understood from the outside. Chapter 1. The most eligible man in the room. Long before he was the most famous cuckold in Britain, Andrew Parker Bowles was the man every mother in the county wanted for her daughter. He had been born into it, the ease and the certainty, on the 27th of December 1939, into a family that had ridden and hunted and worshipped the same way for centuries. His father was Derek Parker Bowles, of Donnington Castle House in Berkshire, a man of the turf and the drawing room who moved without effort among the great and the royal. His mother was Anne de Trafford, a daughter of one of the old Catholic baronetcies, a family whose horses ran at the finest meetings in England. Through his father, the blood ran back to an earl. Through his mother, it ran back to money and land, and the quiet confidence of people who had never once had to ask whether they belonged. He was the eldest of 4 children, and from the beginning he carried the look of a boy who would want for nothing. There is a detail from his christening that tells the whole story of the world he entered. Among those said to have stood as his godparents was Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother herself. The claim is repeated often and documented loosely, so it is best held as the kind of thing that was true of families like his, whether or not it was literally true of him. What matters is that it was believable. A Parker Bowles baby, blessed by the mother of a king, was not a surprise. It was the order of things. The family was Roman Catholic, and this single fact, quiet and unremarkable in a nursery, would one day decide the shape of his entire life. In a country whose throne had been closed to Catholics since the settlement of 1701, a Catholic boy of good family could ride beside royalty, could serve them, could love them, but there were doors that would never open to him. He did not know that yet. No child does. He only knew the fields and the horses and the long certainty of being wanted. He was sent to Ampleforth, the great Benedictine school in Yorkshire, where the sons of Catholic England were shaped by monks into gentlemen and soldiers. From there, he went to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, and in 1960 he was commissioned into the Royal Horse Guards, the regiment known simply as the Blues, one of the 2 mounted regiments of the sovereign's own household cavalry. It was the most glamorous soldiering in Britain. It put a young man on a black horse in a shining breastplate at the shoulder of the monarch. It was less a career than a birthright, and Andrew Parker Bowles wore it as though it had been cut for him alone. He was tall and easy and handsome in the way that made rooms turn. He rode with a recklessness that men admired and women found difficult to look away from. In the spring of 1969, he took that recklessness to its limit and rode in the Grand National, the cruelest steeplechase in the world, over the great black fences at Aintree that broke horses and men every year. He rode a horse called the Fosser, and he came home, and the fact that he had tried at all told everyone what kind of man he was. He was brave in the plain physical way that the English aristocracy prized above almost everything. He did not flinch. Consider what he was at the turn of the 1970s. and how far there was to fall. He was a serving officer in the most senior regiment of the British Army. He was heir to a comfortable estate and an old Catholic name. He was, by the reckoning of every hostess in London and every mother in the shires, among the 2 or 3 most eligible bachelors in the country. He counted the children of the Queen among his friends. He had ridden at Aintree and lived. He was not yet 30, and the whole of that gilded English world lay open in front of him like a country he already owned. It is worth pausing on the sheer scale of the world that produced him, because it explains the confidence that would later look so much like grace. The household cavalry into which he was commissioned was the oldest and most senior body of soldiers in the British Army, its 2 regiments tracing their line back more than 3 centuries to the restoration of the monarchy. To ride in it was to be, quite literally, the body placed between the sovereign and the crowd. His mother's family, the de Traffords, kept racehorses that ran at the great meetings, and the turf ran in his blood as surely as the soldiering. He had grown up among grooms and gallops and the long green order of English country life, in a house with a castle in its very name, taught from the cradle that the world was arranged for the comfort and the pleasure of people exactly like him. A boy raised inside that certainty does not learn to doubt himself. He learns, instead, a kind of unshakable ease, the ease of a man who has never once been made to feel that he does not belong, and that ease would carry him, decades later, through humiliations that would have destroyed a lesser man. What looked, in old age, like superhuman composure was in truth the last trace of a childhood in which nothing had ever gone seriously wrong. There was, too, a particular flavour to the making of him that the word Catholic only begins to capture. At Ampleforth, under the Benedictine monks, the sons of England's old recusant families were raised on a double inheritance, an absolute loyalty to the crown and an absolute fidelity to a faith the crown had once persecuted. They were taught to serve a country that had, for centuries, held their religion at arm's length from its throne. It bred a strange and durable character, proud and dutiful and faintly set apart, a man who could give his whole life to the monarchy while knowing that one door within it would always be barred to him. Andrew Parker Bowles carried that paradox lightly, as such men were trained to, but it was there in him from the very start, the quiet knowledge that he could serve at the heart of the royal world and never quite be wholly of it. It is a small irony of his story, and a bitter one, that the institution which would one day take his wife was the same institution his whole caste had been raised to serve without question, and that he would go on serving it, faithfully, even then. And there was the matter of his nerve, which was not a pose, but a fact, tested in the most public arena English sport could offer. To ride in the Grand National, as he did in the spring of 1969 on a horse called the Fossa, a man had to be willing to gallop at a line of great black fences that killed and maimed horses and riders almost every year, over a course designed to find the limit of both. He did it not because he had to, but because that was the kind of man he was, one who sought out the edge of danger for the pleasure of meeting it. The English aristocracy has always prized physical courage above almost every other quality, valued it more than cleverness or kindness or even honesty, and in that currency, Andrew Parker Bowles was rich. It was part of what made him so attractive, to men and women alike, the sense of a man entirely unafraid. And it is worth holding on to as the story darkens, because the courage was real. Whatever else can be said of how he behaved, no one who knew him ever called him a coward, and the silence he would later keep was not the silence of a timid man. It was the silence of a brave one who had simply decided that some battles were not worth the fighting. And here is the thing the cameras would never quite capture in the decades to come, when they found him grey and stooped and silent at the edge of other people's weddings. That old man had once been the brightest thing in every room he entered. The story that follows is the story of what such a man does when the one thing he cannot ride away from arrives, when the wound is not to the body but to the pride, and when the whole of his gilded world agrees, quietly, that the kindest thing he can do is say nothing at all. He would become very good at saying nothing. It began here, in the certainty of a boy who had never been refused. He said nothing then because he had never needed to. Later, he would say nothing for reasons far harder to name. Chapter 2. The girl who wanted him first. Before she was a queen, before she was a duchess, before she was the most hated woman in Britain, and then, slowly, one of the most accepted, Camilla Shand was a young woman in love with a soldier who would not settle down. That soldier was Andrew Parker Bowles. To understand why he divorced her 30 years later, you have to begin with the plain and often forgotten fact that she loved him long before a prince ever entered the story, and that he, for years, could not quite bring himself to love her back the same way. She had been born on the 17th of July, 1947, at King's College Hospital in London, into a family every bit as sure of itself as his. Her father was Major Bruce Shand, and he was a man worth pausing on, because his shadow falls across this whole story. Bruce Shand was a cavalry officer of the 12th Royal Lancers who had gone to war twice over. He had covered the retreat to Dunkirk in 1940 and been given the Military Cross for it. He had fought across the North African desert and been given a second Military Cross, a bar to the first, in 1942. That same year, near Marsa Matruh, his vehicle was destroyed. 2 of his men were killed, he was wounded, and he was taken prisoner. He spent the rest of the war behind wire in Germany. He came home, became a wine merchant in Mayfair and a master of foxhounds in Sussex, and he raised his daughter to understand exactly what honour was and exactly what it cost. Remember him. He is the one man in this story who will refuse to stay quiet, and the contrast between the father and the husband is the sharpest edge the whole thing has. Camilla grew up between 2 houses, a Georgian place called the Lanes at Plumpton in the Sussex Downs, and a home in South Kensington. It was a childhood of ponies and hunting, and the confident laughter of people who did not worry about money. She was not a conventional beauty in the manner the magazines demanded, and she never pretended to be. What she had was better and rarer. She was funny, warm, earthy, entirely without side, the sort of woman men felt instantly at ease with and never wanted to leave. She could talk about horses and dogs and the weather in a way that made a duke feel like an old friend. It was a kind of charm that photographs could not hold, and it explains everything that follows. She met Andrew Parker Bowles in the late 1960s. The introduction, by one good account, came through his younger brother Simon, who worked at her father's wine firm. She was young, barely out of her teens, and he was the dashing older officer with the black horse and the dangerous reputation, and she fell for him with her whole heart. What followed was not a courtship so much as a long and painful education. Their relationship ran on and off for years, and the reason it kept breaking was always the same. Andrew Parker Bowles could not be faithful to her. He was charming to everyone, and he was charming to a great many women, and he saw no particular reason to stop simply because a girl in Sussex was in love with him. She waited. This is the part the later story would forget, when it painted her only as the woman who stole a prince. For years, Camilla Shand waited for a man who would not commit, who drifted away and drifted back, who let her hope and then let her down, and who at one point turned his attention entirely to another woman altogether, a woman who happened to be the daughter of the Queen. She learned, in those years, a particular kind of patience, the patience of loving someone who will not be pinned down. It would serve her, terribly, for the rest of her life. Think about the shape of it. Here was a young woman of good family, warm and clever, and wanting nothing more than to marry the soldier she adored. And here was the soldier, fond of her, always fond of her, but forever looking over her shoulder at the next room. The pattern was set before the prince ever arrived. When people later asked how Camilla could have tolerated a husband who strayed, and how she could have strayed herself, they were asking a question, the answer to which lay here, in the long, unsettled years of the 1960s, when she learned that this was simply how it was with Andrew, and that if she wanted him at all, she would have to want him on those terms. To understand the daughter, it helps to dwell a little longer on the father, because Bruce Shand was the standard against which every man in Camilla's life would quietly be measured. He had gone to war as a young officer of the 12th Royal Lancers and been decorated for gallantry, not once, but twice. A military cross for the retreat to Dunkirk in 1940, and a bar to it for the desert fighting of 1942. In November of that year, near Marsa Matruh, his armoured car was hit. 2 of his crew were killed beside him, and he was wounded and taken prisoner. He spent the rest of the war behind wire in Germany, and he came home and spoke of none of it for decades, until at last he set it down in a spare and modest memoir. He was the very model of the officer who does his duty and does not talk about it, and he raised Camilla in the warmth of that example. It matters because it tells you what she had been taught to expect of a man, and because it sets up the sharpest contrast the whole story holds. For when the crisis finally came, it was this old soldier, not her husband, who would find the courage to speak. There was another inheritance in the family, quieter and stranger, that reached all the way back to a king. Camilla's great-grandmother was Alice Keppel, the celebrated mistress of King Edward VII, a woman who had conducted a royal love affair with such discretion and such charm that she kept the affection of the king, the tolerance of society, and even a measure of civility from the Queen. The blood of the most successful royal mistress in modern English history ran in the young woman who loved Andrew Parker Bowles, and the pattern of that Edwardian arrangement, the married woman beloved of a prince, was written into her family before she was ever born. No one in the 1960s could have guessed how exactly that pattern would one day repeat itself. But it was there, waiting, a rhyme across a century, and it would come in time to shape the second half of Camilla's life, as surely as her father's example had shaped the first. There is a scale to measure a courtship by, and this one is measured in years of waiting, not weeks, not a single season. Years, across which a young woman gave her heart to a man who took it lightly and returned to him each time he came back, and shaped herself around the space he left. By the time the story turns, by the time a prince appears at a polo ground with his own ideas about Camilla Shand, she has already spent the better part of her young womanhood learning to live with disappointment in the particular shape of Andrew Parker Bowles. She wanted him first. She wanted him most. And that, in the end, may be the cruelest fact in the whole affair, because the man she chose was never quite able to choose her back, and the wound he would nurse in silence for 30 years began, if anyone had been honest enough to say so, as a wound he had first dealt to her. Chapter 3. A Prince, a Princess, and 2 Commoners. In the space of a single strange year, at the very start of the 1970s, both Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla Shand found themselves entangled with the children of the Queen. It is one of those coincidences so neat that it would be dismissed as invention if it were not true. The soldier was courting the princess. The girl who loved the soldier was falling for the prince. 4 young people, 2 of them born to the throne and 2 of them born to serve it, tangled across the same few seasons in the same small world. And out of that tangle came everything. Andrew's connection was with Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter, a young woman as horse-mad and as headstrong as he was. From around 1970, the two were linked, seen together at the events where that set gathered, at the racing and the hunting and the country weekends. They were well matched in temperament, both bold, both blunt, both happiest on horseback. To the newspapers, it looked like the beginning of something serious, and for a time perhaps it was. But there was a wall in the middle of it that neither of them could climb, and the wall was the same quiet fact that had sat in Andrew's nursery all those years before. He was Roman Catholic. The rule was old and cold and absolute. Under the Act of Settlement, anyone in the line of succession who married a Catholic was struck out of that line. Princess Anne stood close to the throne. For her to marry a Catholic would have meant renouncing her place in the succession, a constitutional crisis over a cavalry officer, a thing the palace would never permit, and the couple themselves surely understood. The biographer Sally Bedell Smith put it plainly, that the romance could not have been very serious precisely because Andrew was Catholic, and marriage was therefore all but impossible. Whatever passed between the soldier and the princess, it could not end in a wedding. The door that had been closed in 1701 was still closed, and it closed on him personally, in his own life. At the one moment it might have mattered most. While Andrew looked toward the palace, Camilla was meeting the heir. She encountered Charles, Prince of Wales, at the start of the 1970s, at the polo, in that same overlapping circle, introduced by a mutual friend named Lucia Santa Cruz. The attraction was immediate, and it was real. He was shy, earnest, uncertain, a young man raised in a cold and formal machine, and she was warm and funny and unimpressed by any of it, and she made him feel, perhaps for the first time, entirely at ease. There is a story, told so often it has hardened into legend, that at their first meeting she mentioned her great-grandmother, Alice Keppel, who had been the mistress of King Edward VII, and said something to the effect that her family had a history with his. So how about it? Whether she ever said the words hardly matters. The truth underneath them is real. Camilla Shand descended from the most famous royal mistress in modern English history, and she was standing in front of the future king, and the pattern of the Edwardian past was already reaching forward into the present. For a season or two, the young prince and the warm girl from Sussex fell into something that looked a great deal like love. But it was 1971, and the world was arranged against it in 100 quiet ways. Charles was a serving officer of the Royal Navy, and duty called him away to sea for long stretches. He was the heir to the throne, and the machinery around him did not consider a girl with Camilla's history, a girl who had knocked about the London scene and loved a cavalry officer, to be a suitable future queen. He did not fight for her. Not then. He sailed away and left the matter unresolved, in the way that young men do who assume the important things will still be there when they return. And into that unresolved space stepped Andrew Parker Bowles, back again, the way he always came back. His romance with the princess had gone as far as it could go and stopped at the wall. Camilla was there, as she had always been there, patient and warm and waiting. Whatever the tangle of feeling among the 4 of them, the arithmetic was suddenly simple. The prince was at sea and had not spoken. The princess was beyond reach behind a constitutional wall, and the soldier and the girl who had loved him for years were both, at last, free at the same moment. The law that stood between Andrew and the princess was no mere social nicety, and it is worth understanding exactly how heavy it was, because it decided the direction of his whole life. The Act of Settlement, passed in 1701, had been written in an age of religious terror to guarantee a Protestant succession, and it laid down that anyone who married a Roman Catholic was barred forever from the throne. For a princess standing close in the line, marriage to a Catholic officer was not a matter of taste or of family disapproval. It was a constitutional impossibility, a thing that would have forced a choice between the man and the succession itself. Neither Andrew nor Anne was ever going to detonate a crisis of state over a romance, however fond. And so the thing was quietly impossible from the moment it began. A statute 3 centuries old, drafted by men long dead for reasons that had nothing to do with him, reached into the life of a young cavalry officer and closed a door he could never open. The romance with Charles ran on a different kind of impossibility, the impossibility of timing and of judgment. Camilla had been introduced to the prince by a mutual friend, Lucia Santa Cruz, the clever daughter of a Chilean diplomat, and the two had taken to one another at once. But Charles was young and unsure and bound to the Royal Navy, and the men around him did not think a woman with Camilla's history and Camilla's easy confidence was the stuff of which future queens were made. He went to sea. He did not speak. And in the silence he left behind, the older pattern reasserted itself. The girl and the soldier who had circled one another for years, drifting back together, because the other doors had all, one by one, swung shut. So much of what followed was set in motion not by passion, but by absence, by the things these 4 people were forbidden or failed to do, and the marriage that resulted grew in the space that the impossibilities had cleared. It is worth sitting with how much of what came later was decided by things none of them controlled. A law passed in the reign of a distant king kept Andrew from the princess. The rigid calculations of the palace kept Charles from Camilla. 2 of these 4 people were forbidden to marry the ones they might have chosen, and so the other pairing, the possible one, the permitted one, moved toward the altar almost by elimination. Nobody in this story would ever quite be with the person the heart had first chosen. Charles would carry his feeling for Camilla for the whole of his life. Camilla would carry hers for Andrew into a marriage that could not hold it. And Andrew, who had reached toward a princess and been turned back by an old law, would marry the woman who wanted him, and would spend the next 30 years being asked, silently, whether he had ever truly wanted her at all. Chapter 4. The Wedding of the Season. On the 4th of July, 1973, the Guards' Chapel at Wellington Barracks filled with the flower of British society to watch Andrew Parker Bowles marry Camilla Shand. And for one bright morning, the whole tangled story looked, to the world outside, like a simple and happy ending. It was called the Society Wedding of the Season, and it deserved the name. Some 800 guests crowded into the chapel and spilled into the summer light afterward. The bride wore a diamond tiara that belonged to her family. The groom stood in the dress uniform of the household cavalry, the breastplate catching the sun, every inch the officer the newspapers adored. It was, on the surface, the union of 2 golden young people from the heart of the English establishment. Look closely at who filled the pews, and the surface begins to shimmer with everything it was hiding. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was there. Princess Margaret was there. And Princess Anne was there, in the congregation, watching Andrew Parker Bowles marry another woman, the same Princess Anne, whose name had been linked with his only months before. The royal family had turned out in strength for the wedding of a Catholic cavalry officer, and among them sat a young princess who had, by every account, once hoped this man might be hers. The English aristocracy has always been skilled at sitting in beautiful rooms while the truth goes politely unspoken. That chapel, on that July morning, was a masterclass in it. the bride's family carried its own quiet weight of history. Major Bruce Shand gave away his daughter, the soldier who had won 2 military crosses and survived a German prison camp, handing Camilla into the keeping of a younger officer whose courage was of a showier, less tested kind. And somewhere in the deep background of the day stood the memory of Alice Keppel, the bride's great-grandmother, the king's mistress, whose blood ran in the young woman now kneeling at the altar of the guard's chapel. The past was in that room, whether anyone named it or not. The marriage had very nearly not happened at all, or so the story has always been told. When word reached the Prince of Wales, away at sea, that Camilla was to marry Andrew, he is said to have been heartbroken and to have made some last effort to prevent it. The accounts are second-hand and belong to the realm of biography rather than record, so they must be held lightly. But the shape of them fits everything that came before and everything that came after. Charles had let her go by failing to hold on, and only when she was truly leaving did he understand what leaving meant. By then it was too late. The banns were read. The chapel was booked. Camilla Shand had waited years for Andrew Parker Bowles, and now, at last, he was marrying her, and no prince at sea was going to change that. There is a piece of symmetry to the year that no scriptwriter would dare invent. 4 months after Andrew married Camilla, on the 14th of November 1973, Princess Anne married Captain Mark Phillips in Westminster Abbey before a television audience of hundreds of millions. Within a single year, both of the great romances of Andrew Parker Bowles's youth had resolved themselves in opposite directions and by opposite doors. He had married the girl who wanted him. The princess he had courted had married a soldier of her own. It was as though the whole board had been cleared and reset, each piece moved to the square it was permitted to occupy. The Catholic could not have the princess, so the princess took another cavalryman, and the Catholic took the girl who had loved him all along. Consider the scale of the position Andrew Parker Bowles had reached by the end of that year. He was 33 years old. He was a rising officer in the household cavalry, on the ladder that led toward the very summit of ceremonial soldiering. He had married into a family of decorated soldiers and old money. 800 of the most important people in Britain had come to watch him wed, and the mother of the Queen and 2 princesses had sat among them. His new wife adored him. He stood that summer at the peak of a rise that had begun in a blessed nursery 33 years before, with everything before him and nothing yet lost. The wedding itself deserves to be seen in its full scale because it was the high watermark of Andrew Parker Bowles's public life, the day the world agreed to celebrate him. The Guards' Chapel had been chosen for its regimental grandeur, the spiritual home of the household division, and into it came the cream of 2 overlapping worlds, the aristocracy and the army, some 800 strong. Outside, the summer press recorded the arrivals as they would record a state occasion. The bride came in a gown fit for the season's grandest wedding and wore a family tiara that caught the July light. The groom stood in the full dress uniform of the Blues and Royals, the same shining breastplate he would wear at the ceremonial heart of the monarchy for the next 20 years. To the 800 guests and to the newspapers beyond them, it was the union of 2 people at the very centre of English life, graced by the presence of the mother of the Queen and 2 of her closest kin, a day without a single visible flaw. And the early years of the marriage, for all that would later be said of them, were not unhappy ones. The couple set about the ordinary business of their class, the houses and the horses and the children, and they were, by the accounts of those who knew them, genuinely good company for one another. 2 people who shared a world and a humour even if they did not share a whole heart. If the seeds of the ending were already in the soil, they did not show above the ground for years. That is the quiet horror of the story. and its quiet mercy too. On the chapel steps in the summer of 1973, and for some good while after, there was nothing to see but a happy marriage, and the long, slow turning that would one day undo it had not yet begun to turn. And this is where the first act of the story properly ends, at the height, in the sunlight outside the guard's chapel, with the cavalry officer and his bride and 800 smiling guests. Everything from here runs downhill, though none of them could see it, and the descent would be so slow and so quiet that for years it would look like nothing at all. The marriage that began that morning would last 22 years on paper. Underneath, it would begin to come apart almost at once, because both of the people smiling on those chapel steps had already learned, in their separate ways, to live with wanting someone they could not fully have. He said nothing about that, of course. On his wedding day, a man says nothing about the cracks. He simply smiles for the photographs in his shining breastplate and lets the world believe the happy ending it has come to see. Chapter 5. Two people, two sets of rules. The marriage that had looked like a fairy tale on the chapel steps was, from very early on, an arrangement that both of them quietly broke. This is the uncomfortable centre of the whole story, the part that makes it far stranger than a simple tale of a wronged husband, and it must be told honestly. Andrew Parker Bowles did not become an unfaithful husband when his wife took up with a prince. He had been an unfaithful man his whole adult life, and he remained one inside his marriage. And by most accounts, he strayed early, often, and without much attempt at concealment. His reputation had never been a secret. The dashing officer who could not settle down in the 1960s did not suddenly settle down because a vicar had said the words over him in 1973. He was charming, and he was restless, and he liked women. And marriage did not change any of those things. It was said, and said widely, that his affairs during the marriage included liaisons with several of Camilla's own friends, women from their own tight circle, which is a particular kind of humiliation to hand a wife. Whatever else can be argued about who wronged whom in this marriage, the plain sequence matters. He was the first to be unfaithful, and he was unfaithful as a matter of habit rather than heartbreak. To understand how a marriage could survive on those terms, and survive for more than 2 decades, you have to understand the world it lived inside. Andrew and Camilla belonged to a slice of the English upper class that had, for generations, held a private and unwritten code about marriage. You married well. You produced children and an heir. You kept up appearances with absolute rigour in public. And behind that public front, discreet infidelity was not so much forgiven as simply expected, an accepted feature of grown-up life among people with country houses and long weekends and separate interests. The unforgivable sin in that world was never the affair. It was the scandal. It was letting the thing show. A marriage could contain almost any private betrayal, so long as the surface held and nobody frightened the horses. Set inside that code, the Parker-Bowles marriage was, for a while, entirely functional. They had a great deal in common. They loved the country and the hunt and the same wide circle of friends. They were fond of each other in the easy, unromantic way of two people who genuinely liked each other's company even after the first heat had gone. They set up home at Bolehide Manor, a rambling Elizabethan house near Allington in Wiltshire, all gables and old stone and stables, exactly the sort of place their kind had lived in for centuries. And there, in the proper order of things, came the children. Their son Thomas was born in 1974, the year after the wedding. The Prince of Wales, the man who had loved Camilla and lost her, stood as the boy's godfather, which tells you how tightly this circle was already wound. how the future king had not gone away, but had folded himself into the family as a friend. A daughter, Laura, followed in 1978. The children were adored. Whatever was wrong between the parents, and things were wrong almost from the start, the affection for Tom and Laura was real, and it was permanent, and it would be the one thing that survived every storm still standing, the one common interest they would still name when everything else had gone. But look at the marriage without the soft focus, and a harder picture forms. Here was a husband who was frequently elsewhere, physically and otherwise, a man whose eye and whose evenings wandered. Here was a wife, warm and loving and made for devotion, who had married the one man she had wanted for years and found that having him had not cured his restlessness at all. She had waited through his infidelities before the wedding. Now she was living through them after it, and the prince who had let her go was still there, at every hunt and every dinner, godfather to her son, carrying his own unfinished feeling, watching the woman he had failed to marry raise another man's children in a house he did not share. It is tempting, from the outside, to reach for judgment here, to sort these people into the wronged and the wrongdoers. The truth resists it. This was not a marriage with one villain. It was a marriage between two people who had each, before they ever met at the altar, learned to live with the gap between what they had and what they wanted. He filled that gap with other women. She had filled it, for years, simply by waiting for him. Now the gap was still there, inside the marriage, and it was only a matter of time before she began to fill it the way he did, with someone else, with the one person who had never stopped wanting her. There is a number that captures the quiet arithmetic of this house better than any adjective. 22 years. That is how long this marriage would formally last, from the summer of 1973 to the divorce of 1995. 2 children. 2 grand houses across those years. 1 shared circle of perhaps a few dozen close friends, inside which almost everyone eventually knew almost everything. And a code of silence so complete that the whole structure could stand for 2 decades on foundations that had cracked in the first years. It held because everyone agreed to let it hold. It held because nobody spoke. The code that governed a marriage like theirs was older than either of them, and it is worth spelling out plainly, because to modern ears it can sound almost unbelievable. Among the landed families of England, marriage had long been understood as a settlement and a partnership as much as a romance, a joining of names and acres and expectations, within which a certain amount of private wandering was quietly tolerated, so long as it never threatened the whole. Discretion was the one iron rule. A husband or a wife might stray, and the world would look the other way, provided the marriage held its shape in public and no scandal ever reached the newspapers. It was a system built for the protection of property and pride, and it had governed such houses for generations without apology. Andrew and Camilla had both been raised inside it, and both understood its terms without ever needing to state them. Set inside that world, the surface of their life was, for years, entirely convincing. Bolehide Manor was exactly the sort of house their kind had always kept, old and gabled and full of dogs and boots and the smell of the stables. The children grew up in it happily. Tom bound in time for Eton, Laura for a good girls' school, both of them adored by parents who agreed on very little else. Weekends were for hunting and shooting and the long lunches of the county set. To any visitor, it looked like one of 1,000 contented marriages among the English gentry, and in many of the ways that such marriages counted their success, it was exactly that. The trouble was never on the surface. The trouble was that the surface was all there was, and that beneath it both of them had already begun, in their separate ways, to look elsewhere for the thing the marriage did not give them. There is one more detail from these years that captures the strangeness at the heart of the household, and it concerns the christening of the elder child. When Tom was born in 1974, the godfather chosen for him was none other than the Prince of Wales, the man who had loved Camilla before the marriage and who would love her through it and long after it. The future king was folded into the family as an intimate, a friend, close enough to stand sponsor to its firstborn son. Whatever one makes of the affair that would later consume them all, it did not arrive from outside the family like a thief in the night. It grew inside it, among people already bound together by friendship and blood, and the small, dense world they all shared. That is what made it so hard, in the end, to sort the innocent from the guilty. There was no clean line between the marriage and the affair, no wall between the husband's world and the lover's, because they were, from the very beginning, the same world, the same friends, the same christenings and hunts and country weekends. The prince stood godfather to the son of the woman he loved and the man he was quietly wronging, and everyone smiled, and no one said a word. And Andrew, the man at the centre of it, said nothing. He said nothing about his own affairs, because a gentleman did not discuss such things. He would say nothing, soon, about his wife's. The silence that would one day make him famous, the silence the whole country would puzzle over, did not begin with the prince or the tape or the divorce. It began here, in a Wiltshire manor house in the middle of the 1970s, in the ordinary machinery of an upper-class marriage that had agreed, as such marriages did, that the truth was a private matter and the surface was everything. He was very good at the surface. He had been raised to it. He smiled, and he soldiered, and he said nothing, and the cracks widened underneath the smiling in a silence that would last, in the end, for the rest of his life. Chapter 6. The Prince Moves Next Door. In the summer of 1980, a house changed hands in Gloucestershire, and everything about the Parker Bowles marriage changed with it. The house was Highgrove, near Tetbury, a solid Georgian place bought that August by the Duchy of Cornwall, the estate that funds the Prince of Wales, for a sum reported to be somewhere between £800,000 and £1 million. On paper, it was simply a prince acquiring a country seat. In truth, it was the moment the slow tragedy of these 4 lives gathered speed, because of a single fact that a map makes obvious. Highgrove sat only a short drive from the Parker Bowles home, in the very heart of the same hunting country, the country of the Duke of Beaufort's hunt, where Camilla rode and where the whole of their circle gathered through the long English winters. Whether by design or by the deep pull of the heart that dresses itself up as coincidence, the Prince of Wales had installed himself inside Camilla's own county, inside her own hunt, inside the daily orbit of her life. He had known the Beaufort country since childhood. He hunted with the Duke's pack, and now he had a house there, his own house, private and secure. A short ride across the fields from the woman he had never stopped loving. Camilla herself, comfortable and helpful in the way of old friends, recommended a garden designer to him for the grounds. The proximity was not hidden. It was woven into the ordinary fabric of their shared world, hunts and lunches and weekends, and it made the impossible suddenly, quietly, easy. For the affair between Charles and Camilla had, by this point, come back to life. It had rekindled around 1979, after years in which they had been friends and neighbours, and nothing more, or nothing anyone could prove. The prince, older now, and no closer to a marriage of his own, had found his way back to the one person who made him feel understood. And she, in a marriage that had never given her the fidelity she had longed for, had let him. Highgrove did not begin the affair, but Highgrove gave it a home, a geography, a set of country houses within easy reach of one another, and it turned what might have been an occasional weakness into something with the rhythm and permanence of a second marriage conducted in the gaps of the first. And here the story arrives at its hardest question, the one that hangs over Andrew Parker Bowles for the rest of his life. What did he know, and what did he allow? The accounts of biographers, and they are interpretation rather than proof, suggest that Andrew knew a great deal, and that he tolerated it. Some go further and say he effectively approved, that he raised no serious objection to his wife's relationship with the prince, that the two men remained on cordial terms throughout, hunting the same country, moving in the same circle, godfather and husband and lover, all folded into one small world. The precise degree of his knowledge can never be fixed with certainty, and honesty demands that it be flagged as uncertain. But the broad shape is not seriously in doubt. Andrew Parker Bowles was not a husband deceived in the dark. He was a husband who, to a very large extent, knew and looked away. Why would a man do that? The uncomfortable answer runs back through everything already told. He was himself unfaithful, freely and repeatedly, and a man conducting his own affairs is in a poor position to forbid his wife hers. The code of his class made a quiet accommodation not only possible, but almost respectable, so long as nobody spoke. And there was something else, something colder and more practical that the later story would force into the light. A husband who made no trouble kept everything. He kept his place in the circle. He kept his friendships at the palace. He kept the smooth surface of a life that suited him. A husband who made trouble would have blown all of it apart and gained nothing but the brief satisfaction of a scene. Andrew Parker Bowles did not make scenes. He never had. So the arrangement settled into place, and it was, for a period in the early 1980s, remarkably stable. Consider the household it produced. A husband with his own romances, often away, untroubled. A wife with a prince a few fields distant, loved at last by someone even if not by the man she had married. 2 children growing up, adored in a Wiltshire manor. A future king riding to hounds through the same country, welcome at the same tables. It was a machine with many moving parts, and it ran, for a while, without a sound, oiled entirely by discretion and by the willingness of every person inside it to say nothing about what every person inside it knew. There is a scale to the wealth and privilege that made such a life possible, and it is worth pausing on. A prince's country house bought for the better part of £1 million at the start of the 1980s, a sum that would be many times that today. A hunt whose history ran back centuries, whose country covered tens of thousands of acres of Gloucestershire and Wiltshire. 2 families with grand houses of their own within a morning's ride. A world of perhaps a few hundred people who owned most of what mattered in that corner of England, and who guarded one another's secrets as a matter of caste. It took a great deal of money and a great deal of land to build a stage on which an affair between a princess's neighbour and a future king could run for years without a single word reaching the street. It is worth dwelling on the machinery of money and land that made this possible. Because the affair did not float free of the world, it was built on a very particular geography. Highgrove belonged not to the prince personally, but to the Duchy of Cornwall, the ancient estate that has funded the heir to the throne since the 14th century, a landholding of tens of thousands of acres spread across the west of England. When the duchy bought the house in the summer of 1980, for a sum reported at close to £1 million, it was acquiring far more than a residence. It was placing the future king in the heart of the Beaufort country, a stretch of Gloucestershire and Wiltshire hunted by one of the oldest and grandest packs in England, whose territory ran across land the Parker Bowleses knew as their own. The hunt was the social engine of that whole world, the thing that gathered everyone together through the long winter. And now, the prince and the married woman he loved rode out with the same field, over the same fields, weekend after weekend. Whether Charles chose the house for its nearness to Camilla, or whether the nearness was simply the gift of a coincidence he did not resist, the effect was the same. A relationship that might have withered on distance was given, instead, a permanent home. The two of them could meet in the ordinary course of a shared country life, at meets and lunches and the houses of mutual friends, with nothing to explain and nothing obviously to hide. It was the perfect cover, hidden in plain sight, protected by the very ordinariness of the world it moved through. And it turned the affair from a thing of stolen moments into something with the steadiness and the rhythm of a second marriage, conducted in the gaps of the first, a few fields apart. And here the moral ground grows genuinely uncertain, in a way the story must sit with rather than resolve. If Andrew knew, and the weight of the accounts says that he did, then his silence in these years was already the silence that would later make him famous, only turned inward toward his own marriage. He did not confront. He did not forbid. He did not force the issue to a crisis that might have ended the affair before it hardened into a second life. Whether that was tolerance born of his own guilt, or a genuine and unusual generosity, or a simple cold calculation about what a scene would cost him, cannot be known from the outside, and honesty requires that all three be left on the table. What can be said is that the arrangement suited him well enough that he never moved to end it, and that a man who profits, however modestly, from looking away is a man whose motives can never afterward be called simple. But stages like that depend entirely on the silence of everyone standing on them, and silence, in the end, is the most fragile material in the world. The arrangement at the heart of the Beaufort country worked only so long as it stayed private. The moment it became public, the moment one thread was pulled, the whole careful machine would fly apart and take the reputations of everyone inside it with it. Andrew Parker Bowles had chosen, for reasons noble or convenient or both, to say nothing and keep everything. He could not have known that a far larger and more dangerous silence was about to be broken, not by him and not by his wife, but by the arrival into this closed and gilded world of a 19-year-old girl who did not know the rules and who would refuse, when the time came, to play by them. Chapter 7. The Bride Who Saw the Bracelet. When Charles married Diana in 1981, he did not stop loving the woman who was married to Andrew Parker Bowles, and that single fact would eventually bring the whole hidden structure crashing into the daylight. The wedding itself, on the 29th of July, 1981, was the grandest spectacle the modern monarchy had ever staged. A congregation of thousands in St. Paul's Cathedral. A television audience estimated at 750 million people around the world. A young bride of 20, Lady Diana Spencer, in a gown with a train that seemed to go on forever, walking toward a prince who was supposed to represent the fairy tale in its purest form. The nation wept for joy, and at the heart of it stood a groom who was, by the private truth of his own heart, in love with someone else. Camilla was at the wedding. Of course she was. She was part of the circle, a friend of the family, the wife of a brother officer. She sat in St. Paul's and watched the man she loved marry a teenage girl, and if there is a colder image of the arrangement's cruelty than that, it is hard to find. But the sharper wound of the whole affair belonged to the bride, and it came in the shape of a small piece of jewellery. Shortly before the wedding, Diana discovered a bracelet that Charles had commissioned for Camilla. It was engraved with 2 letters, or 2 little nicknames, the private names the prince and his married friend used for one another, Fred and Gladys. To Diana, barely 20 and about to give her life to this man, the discovery was a catastrophe. She understood, before she had even walked down the aisle, that she was marrying into a space that was already occupied. That bracelet is one of the small, hard objects around which this whole story keeps turning, and it is worth holding for a moment because it tells you everything about the position Andrew Parker Bowles occupied. His wife had a private nickname with the Prince of Wales. His wife received engraved jewellery from the heir to the throne on the eve of that heir's own wedding. This was not a rumour whispered across a ballroom. It was a fact solid enough to hold in the hand, and it was known, in its essentials, to the small circle that included Andrew himself. And still, he said nothing. Still, the surface held. A royal wedding went ahead before 750 million people, while, inside the tiny world that knew, the truth sat in a jeweller's box, engraved. For a few years, the new arrangement held its shape, more crowded now, but still standing. The affair between Charles and Camilla is generally said to have cooled for a period around the marriage, as the prince tried, in his way, to make the fairy tale real. But it did not last. The marriage of Charles and Diana was mismatched from the start, a union of two people with almost nothing in common beyond the machine that had pushed them together. And as it curdled, the prince drifted back, as he always drifted back, toward Camilla. By the middle of the decade, the affair had resumed in earnest, and now there were not 3 marriages loosely tangled, but a single knot pulled tight, a prince and princess trapped in a failing marriage, a cavalry officer and his wife trapped in another, and one woman, Camilla, standing at the crossing point of both. Think about where this left Andrew. He was, by the middle of the 1980s, a man of real distinction in his own right, climbing steadily through the senior ranks of the household cavalry, respected, decorated, on his way toward the ceremonial summit of his profession. And he was, simultaneously, in the deep privacy of the circle, the husband of the woman the Prince of Wales loved, the man whose marriage sat quietly in the way of the greatest romantic tangle in the royal family. He carried both of those truths at once. In the daylight, he was Brigadier material, a pillar of the establishment. In the shadow, he was the wronged and complicit husband of a future king's mistress. He never let the two touch. He never let the shadow reach the daylight. He said nothing, and he soldiered on, and the uniform did its work of making him look like exactly what he was supposed to be. But the girl who had found the bracelet was not made of the same material as the rest of them. Diana had not been raised inside the code. She was younger, more modern, more emotionally honest, and far more wounded than the closed world of the Beaufort country understood. She would not learn to smile at the surface while the truth ate the foundations. She would not agree to say nothing, and in that refusal, though no one could see it yet, lay the end of the entire arrangement. The moment the private machine would be dragged into the most public place imaginable and broken apart in front of the world. The people who had kept the secret for years had reckoned without a bride who refused to keep it, and Andrew Parker Bowles, master of silence, was about to be exposed by the one person in the story constitutionally incapable of it. For Andrew, the years around the royal wedding were, outwardly, the best of his career, and the contrast between his public assent and his private position is one of the strangest features of the whole story. While his wife's name was being quietly linked, in the circles that knew, to the heir to the throne, Andrew himself was climbing steadily toward the summit of his profession. He commanded the household cavalry-mounted regiment in the early 1980s, the very soldiers who escort the sovereign on the great occasions of state. He was decorated, respected, marked out for the top. To the army and the public, he was a model officer at the height of his powers. To the small circle that knew the truth, he was something far more complicated, the husband of the future king's beloved. He carried both lives at once and let neither touch the other, and the discipline that took must have been immense, though he never once allowed it to show. The affair, in these years, ran through its own quieter seasons, cooling for a time around the royal wedding as the prince tried, in his way, to make his new marriage work, then warming again as that marriage failed. Diana, young and isolated and increasingly aware of the shadow across her life, began to understand that she had married into a space that was already occupied, and the knowledge curdled inside the grand new marriage from very early on. What looked to the world like the happiest union in the kingdom was within months a household of suspicion and unhappiness, and the woman at the centre of the suspicion was the wife of Andrew Parker Bowles. The bracelet deserves one more moment, because it is one of the small, hard objects around which this whole story keeps turning, like the tape that was still to come and the uniform he wore through all of it. A wife's private nickname with the heir to the throne, engraved in gold on the eve of that heir's own wedding, is not a rumour or an interpretation. It is a fact a person could hold in the hand, and it was known, in its essentials, to the circle that included Andrew himself. He knew that such things existed. He knew what they meant. And he made, as far as anyone can tell, no protest at all, then or ever. The objects in this story keep their silence as faithfully as the man does: the bracelet in its box, the tape in the dark, the great portrait still years away, each one holding a truth that everyone could see and no one would say aloud. There is a scale worth setting down here to measure the gap between the public fairy tale and the private truth. 750 million people watched the wedding of the prince and his bride. A congregation of some 3,500 filled St. Paul's. The dress alone had a train of over 7 meters, and beneath all of it, known to a circle you could have seated in a single drawing room, sat one small engraved bracelet and 2 private nicknames, the seed of a scandal that would one day be as famous as the wedding itself. The largest public spectacle of the age was built directly on top of the smallest and most private of betrayals, and the man married to the woman at the centre of it stood in his uniform and said nothing at all. Chapter 8. The tape no one knew existed. On a December night in 1989, a private telephone call was pulled out of the air and recorded, and not one of the people whose lives it would eventually detonate had the faintest idea that it existed. This is the hinge of the entire story, the moment the slow, private tragedy acquired a fuse. And the terrible thing about it is how ordinary the night itself was. 2 people who loved each other, both married to other people, talked on the telephone late at night, the way lovers do, tender and silly and unguarded, saying the small, foolish things that are meant for one pair of ears and no others. The date was the 18th of December, 1989. The 2 voices were the Prince of Wales and Camilla Parker Bowles, and somewhere out in the dark, a stranger with a radio scanner was listening and pressed record. By this point, the affair had been running, on and off, for the better part of a decade since its revival, and in earnest again since around 1986. The marriage of Charles and Diana had become a cold and unhappy thing, 2 people living increasingly separate lives inside the shell of the most famous marriage in the world. And in 1989, the strain reached the surface in a way it had not before. At a party that year, Diana is said to have confronted Camilla directly, to have found her and faced her and told her, in words that have echoed ever since, that she knew exactly what was going on between her and Charles. It was a moment of raw honesty, entirely alien to the world the older generation had built. A young wife refusing to pretend, saying the unsayable to the other woman's face. The silence was already beginning to fail. The bride who would not keep the secret was starting to speak. But it was the tape, not the confrontation, that would do the real damage. and the cruelty of it lay in the delay. The call was recorded in December of 1989, and then it simply sat, in the hands of whoever held it, a loaded thing waiting in the dark. For 3 years it did not surface in Britain. 3 years in which the marriages went on decaying, in which the public still largely believed in the fairy tale, in which Andrew Parker Bowles went on rising through his profession and saying nothing, all of them living their lives on top of a recording that would, when it finally came, rearrange every one of those lives permanently. They did not know it was there. That is the horror and the fascination of it. The most private 6 minutes of the prince's life had already been captured and were already waiting, and the people on the tape carried on in complete ignorance of the fact that their secret was no longer entirely their own. Consider Andrew's position in those years, because it was about to be transformed utterly, and he had no warning at all. Between 1987 and 1990, he held the ceremonial office of Silver Stick in waiting to the Queen, one of the sovereign's personal ceremonial guardians, a role of genuine intimacy with the monarch, riding at her side on the great state occasions. In 1990, he was promoted Brigadier. He was, in these very years, as close to the throne in his public life as a soldier could be, a trusted and decorated officer at the ceremonial heart of the monarchy. And in his private life, he was the husband of the woman on the tape. The two facts were about to be forced together in the most public way imaginable, and the man who had spent his whole life keeping the daylight and the shadow apart was about to watch them collide in front of the entire country. It is worth stating plainly what the tape actually was, because its content is inseparable from the scale of the humiliation it caused. It was not a discussion of state secrets, or a plot, or a crime. It was an intimate, loving, and at moments absurdly comic conversation between two middle-aged people who adored each other. In it, the prince said things no man ever expects to have read aloud, foolish, tender things about wanting to be close to her, a joke that would become notorious across the world about what he might come back as in another life. Spoken in the dark between two lovers, it was ordinary human silliness. Printed on the front page of a newspaper, it would be the most excruciating document ever attached to a future king, and by extension, the most excruciating thing ever attached to the man that future king's lover happened to be married to. The manner of the interception matters, because it is the detail that turns a private affair into a modern tragedy. The call was not betrayed by a servant or a confidant. It was plucked out of the air. In those years, before the telephones people carried were made secure, a conversation on certain kinds of handset could be caught by anyone with a radio scanner and the patience to trawl the airwaves. And somewhere in the dark, a listener had done exactly that, had found the voices of the prince and his lover, and had pressed record. It was a wholly new kind of exposure, one no code of aristocratic discretion had ever been built to withstand. The old world had protected its secrets with the loyalty of servants and the silence of friends. It had no defense at all against a stranger with a machine, listening from a bedroom miles away. The tape was the future breaking into a very old story, and it would prove that no amount of breeding or discretion could protect a secret once the airwaves themselves had turned informer. And all the while, Andrew rose. In the years the tape sat waiting, between 1987 and 1990, he held the office of Silver Stick in waiting to the Queen, one of the most intimate of the ceremonial roles, riding at the sovereign's side on the great occasions of state. In 1990, he was made a brigadier. He was, in the very years his wife's recorded voice lay hidden like a mine, closer to the throne in his public duties than almost any soldier in the land. The two facts, the private tape and the public honour, were growing toward one another in the dark, and when at last they met, the collision would define him forever. What is almost unbearable looking back is the ordinariness of the years the tape spent waiting. For 3 years after that December night, life simply went on. The prince and Camilla continued much as before. Andrew continued his steady climb through the army. Diana's unhappiness deepened, and the marriage of the Waleses sank slowly toward its public collapse. And through all of it, the recording sat somewhere in the dark, complete, damning, and entirely unknown to the people whose lives it would one day rearrange. They made their plans and kept their secrets and guarded their surfaces, never dreaming that the most private words any of them had spoken were already captured and already waiting. It is the cruelest kind of dramatic irony, the kind in which the watchers know what the characters cannot, except that here the watchers were the whole future British public, and the characters were living, unaware, on top of the very thing that would expose them all. The people in this story were, in the last days before the storm, living the final hours of a world that was about to end. Somewhere the recording waited. In the palaces and the country houses, the prince and the princess circled one another in a marriage everyone could now see was failing. Camilla loved a man she could not have in the open. Andrew rose through his profession and kept his counsel. Bruce Shand, the old soldier, watched his daughter's life with a father's growing anger. And a teenage girl, grown into a wounded young woman, prepared, in her own way, to stop pretending. All the pieces were in place. All that was needed was for someone to publish the tape, and for the private silence that had held for 2 decades to become a public roar. That moment was coming, and when it came, it would not spare a single one of them. It would end the fairy tale. It would drag the Prince of Wales through a humiliation from which his reputation would take years to recover. It would make Camilla, for a time, the most reviled woman in the country. And it would turn Andrew Parker Bowles, decorated soldier, silver stick to the Queen, master of a lifetime's discretion, into a figure of national pity and mockery, the most famous wronged husband in Britain, a man whose private wound was about to be printed in 6 searing minutes for millions of strangers to read over their breakfast. The tape existed. No one on it knew. And the silence Andrew had kept so carefully for so long was about to be taken out of his hands entirely. Chapter 9. The War of the Waleses. By 1992, the royal marriage was no longer a private matter falling quietly apart behind palace walls. It had become a public war, fought through the newspapers, briefed and counter-briefed, leaked and denied, the most bitter and most watched marital breakdown of the century. The papers gave it a name that stuck, the War of the Waleses, and it turned the private misery of a prince and princess into a running national serial, played out over months in headlines and photographs and carefully placed stories. And every escalation in that war brought the buried secret at the heart of it. The affair between the prince and the wife of Andrew Parker Bowles, a little closer to the surface. The first great blow fell in the summer of 1992, when a book appeared that changed everything. It was written by the journalist Andrew Morton, and though it did not carry her name as a source, it was quickly understood to have been produced with the secret cooperation of the Princess of Wales herself. It told the story of the marriage from Diana's side, and it was devastating. It described her unhappiness, her sense of a third person always present in the marriage, her despair. The third person was not named in the way a court document names someone, but everyone understood who was meant. The book made public, for the first time and on a national scale, the claim that the fairy tale marriage had been haunted from the start by another woman, and that the other woman was Camilla. The surface, held for so long, had finally been broken, and it had been broken by the bride who would not keep the secret. For Andrew Parker Bowles, The summer of that book was the beginning of the end of his privacy. Until then, whatever the circle knew, the wider world had been allowed to believe in the fairy tale. Now the wife he was married to was being discussed in millions of homes as the shadow across the marriage of the future king. His name, by simple association, was being drawn toward a scandal he had done nothing publicly to cause. And still, in keeping with everything he had ever been, he said nothing. He did not confirm, he did not deny, he did not brief a friendly journalist or place a wounded word. He absorbed it in silence and went on with his soldiering as the storm around his marriage grew louder by the week. The blows kept coming. Later that summer came another tape, this one a recorded telephone conversation between the Princess of Wales and a close male friend, an intimate call full of affection and private names, which the press labelled Squidgygate after a pet name used in it. Now, both sides of the failing marriage had been caught on tape. The message to the public was clear and corrosive. This was not a fairy tale with one flaw. This was a marriage in which both the prince and the princess had turned elsewhere for comfort, and the machinery of secrecy that had protected the royal family for generations had plainly failed. The age of deference, in which the press had quietly looked away from royal private lives, was over. Everything was now fair game. And then, on the 9th of December, 1992, the thing became official. The Prime Minister, John Major, rose in the House of Commons and announced to Parliament that the Prince and Princess of Wales had agreed to separate. It was stated, with a straight face that fooled no one, that the separation had no constitutional implications and that there was no question of a divorce or of the succession being affected. But the fairy tale was formally, publicly dead. The most celebrated marriage of the age had ended, announced not by a palace press officer, but from the floor of the House of Commons, a measure of how far the private had become the national. And every person who heard that announcement understood that behind it, unspoken in the chamber, stood the figure of the other woman, and behind her, unspoken and almost unnoticed, stood her husband. Spare a thought for the strangeness of Andrew's position in that December. His marriage was intact on paper. He and Camilla were still, in the eyes of the law, husband and wife. And yet the collapse of an entirely different marriage, the prince's, was the lead story in every newspaper in the country, precisely because of his own wife's part in it. He was a married man watching another couple's separation announced in Parliament, knowing that the reason it mattered so much, the reason it had reached the floor of the Commons at all, was the woman who shared his name. Few men in history can have occupied so peculiar a spot, so close to the centre of a national drama, and yet so completely silent within it, a principal player who never once stepped onto the stage. The scale of the thing by the end of 1992 is worth measuring because it shows how far the private world of the Beaufort country had been dragged into the open. A book that sold in the millions and was serialised across the largest newspapers in the land, a separation announced in the Mother of Parliaments, 2 intimate tapes already circulating or published, a royal marriage that had begun before 750 million television viewers now ending in the full glare of a press that had abandoned its old restraint. And at the eye of it, quiet and unmoving, a cavalry officer who had spent his whole life keeping the surface smooth, watching that surface shatter in a way no amount of discretion on his part could now repair. The change in the press that made all this possible was itself a kind of revolution, and Andrew Parker Bowles was among its quietest casualties. For most of the 20th century, the British newspapers had observed an unwritten pact of deference toward the private lives of the royal family, reporting the pageantry and looking away from the rest. That pact died in the early 1990s. The Morton book, serialised across a great national newspaper and selling in the millions, showed that the appetite for the royal family's private misery was enormous, and that the old restraint could be abandoned without penalty. Once one paper had broken the taboo, all of them followed, and the private lives of the Waleses and everyone entangled with them became the most profitable story in the country. The genie could not be put back in the bottle. For a man like Andrew, raised in the belief that a gentleman's private affairs were nobody's business but his own, it was the collapse of the entire world that had protected him. He watched it happen without a word. As the book was serialized and the nation devoured it, as the third person in the marriage was discussed in every home in the land, as his own wife became a household name for the worst of reasons, he gave the circling reporters nothing at all. There was no shortage of chances to speak. A wronged husband was exactly the figure the papers most wanted, and the money and the sympathy on offer would have been considerable. He turned it all down by the simple method of saying nothing, and the silence, in the roar of that year, was almost the loudest thing about him. It is worth naming what that silence was worth in hard terms, because the temptation he resisted was real and enormous. In the market that had opened up around the royal marriage, the first husband's story was among the most valuable a newspaper could buy. A frank interview, a set of memories, a single photograph of the wounded man would have commanded a great sum and a great wave of public sympathy, and it would have been the easiest thing in the world to justify, a man merely telling his own truth after years of humiliation. Others closer to the family, and others further from it, were selling far less for far more. Andrew sold nothing. He let the most sympathetic role in the entire drama, the innocent and wronged husband, sit there unclaimed, because to claim it would have meant speaking, and speaking was the one thing he would not do. He had kept his own counsel through his own affairs and through his wife's. He had said nothing when a bracelet was engraved, and nothing when a book was published, and nothing when a separation was announced. But the worst was still to come, and it would be worse precisely because it would be aimed, this time, not at the prince or the princess, but at the tender and ridiculous private heart of his own wife's love affair. The tape from that December night 3 years earlier was still out there, and in January of the new year, a British newspaper was going to print every word of it. The War of the Waleses was about to claim its most personal casualty, and his name was Parker Bowles. Chapter 10. 6 Minutes That Ruined a Marriage. On the 17th of January 1993, Britain woke to the most humiliating 6 minutes ever printed about its future king, and Andrew Parker Bowles woke to find himself, overnight and without having said a single word, the most famous wronged husband in the country. The Sunday People and the Sunday Mirror had done it. They had printed the transcript of the tape recorded on that December night in 1989, the intimate call between Charles and Camilla, in full, word for word, for anyone with a few pence and a passing curiosity to read. The thing that had waited in the dark for 3 years was suddenly everywhere, on every breakfast table, in every newsagent. The private murmurings of two lovers turned into the most talked-about document in the land. The content was, by any measure, mortifying. The call was tender and silly, and unmistakably the talk of two people deeply in love, and it contained a joke of the prince's, a piece of intimate nonsense about what he might wish to come back as in another life, that was so startling and so comic and so utterly human that it travelled around the world within days and became a byword. It was the kind of thing that is sweet in the private dark and unbearable in cold print. Read aloud on the front page, stripped of the affection that had produced it, it made the heir to the throne a figure of ridicule, and made his lover a figure of scandal. The scandal even acquired a mocking name of its own, drawn from that one absurd remark. and the name followed both of them for years. Now hold the moment from Andrew's side of it, because that is the whole point of this story. He had not been on the tape. He had said nothing, done nothing, leaked nothing. He was, in the most literal sense, an innocent party, a man whose only connection to the scandal was that he happened to be married to one of the two voices on it. And yet the publication fell on him with a particular and cruel weight, because it made his private humiliation a matter of public record. Every reader of those newspapers now knew, in the most vivid and intimate detail imaginable, that the wife of Brigadier Andrew Parker Bowles was carrying on a love affair with the Prince of Wales. The most private wound a husband can suffer had been printed in 6 searing minutes and handed to millions of strangers to read over their tea. The backlash, when it came, was savage, though it was aimed mostly at the prince. Diana's own protection officer, Ken Wharf, later recorded that the reaction was ferocious, that even figures normally loyal to the crown were appalled, that the damage to the prince's standing was immense. Diana herself is said to have called the tape simply sick. The nation, which had wept at the wedding 12 years before, now recoiled. And in all of this, the man with perhaps the greatest personal grievance of anyone, the husband, said nothing. He did not give an interview to sell his side. He did not pose, wounded, for a sympathetic photographer. He did not accept the invitation, surely extended 100 times over in those weeks, to tell the world how it felt to read that transcript over breakfast. He simply endured it, in the silence he had always kept, while the country talked of nothing else. It is worth trying to feel the size of the exposure, because it is the measure of the silence that met it. This was one of the most famous news events of the entire decade in Britain, splashed across newspapers that sold many millions of copies between them, discussed on every broadcast, turned into jokes on every high street. The private life of Andrew Parker Bowles, which he had guarded with the discipline of a lifetime, was now among the most public in the nation, and his response to the greatest violation of his privacy imaginable was to give the press absolutely nothing. Where another man would have raged, or wept, or sold, or sued, he offered only the same closed and dignified quiet he had offered his whole life. To some it looked like strength. To others, it looked like weakness, or complicity, or a man with too much of his own to hide. The truth, as ever with him, stayed locked behind the silence. For the marriage itself, the tape was the end, whatever the law would take another 2 years to record. You cannot go on as husband and wife once the whole country has read the transcript of your wife's love affair with the future king. The pretense that had held the Parker Bowles marriage together for 20 years, the smooth surface, the unspoken accommodation, the code of discretion, depended entirely on the thing never becoming public. Now it was as public as anything in Britain had ever been. The surface was not merely cracked, it was gone, blown away in 6 minutes of transcript, and there was no putting it back. The machine of silence that had run so smoothly through the Beaufort country for a decade had finally, catastrophically, failed. The scale of the publication is difficult to overstate, and it is the true measure of what Andrew endured in silence. The 2 newspapers that printed the transcript sold, between them, many millions of copies, and the story did not stay on their pages. It was picked up and repeated across every newspaper, every broadcast, every conversation in every pub and kitchen in the country. The most private 6 minutes in the life of the future king became, within days, the most public words in Britain. The affair even acquired a mocking nickname, drawn from the tape's most notorious joke, a name so crude and so memorable that it followed the prince and Camilla for years and turned the whole tragedy in the popular telling into a national smutty punchline. There was no corner of British life in the early months of 1993 where a person could escape it. And in the middle of that storm of mockery stood a man who had done nothing to earn it, the husband, whose only offence was to have married one of the voices on the tape. Every crude joke about the prince was, by unavoidable implication, a joke about the man whose wife the prince had been talking to. Andrew Parker Bowles, decorated soldier and silver stick to the Queen, was now the answer to the ugliest riddle in Britain, and he had to walk through his ordinary life to his club and his regiment and his racing, knowing that every stranger who recognised him was thinking of that transcript. Most men would have fled or raged, or at the very least issued some dignified statement of wounded feeling. He did none of it. He went on exactly as before and said nothing, and let the country make its jokes. Picture the ordinary indignities of it, the ones no biography records. The recognising glance on the racecourse, the conversation that stopped when he entered a room, the friends who did not know what to say, and the strangers who imagined they knew everything. For a proud man, raised to believe that a gentleman's private life was sacred, each of these small moments was its own quiet wound, and there were thousands of them, day after day, through the whole of that year and beyond. He met every one of them the same way, with a level look and a change of subject, and not one word of complaint. And the effort that must have cost him can only be guessed at, because he never once let a soul see it. And so, Andrew Parker Bowles stood, in the early weeks of 1993, at the ruin of the private world he had spent his life protecting. His wife's love affair was national news. His marriage was finished in all but name. His own dignity was the one thing he had managed to keep, and he had kept it by the only method he had ever trusted, by saying nothing at all. But even that silence was about to be measured against another man's example, and found by some wanting. For there was one person close to this story who refused to stay quiet, one old soldier who decided that somebody, at last, ought to speak. And it was not the husband, it was the father. Chapter 11. The father who spoke, and the husband who didn't. One old soldier in this story refused to stay silent, and it was not the husband. It was Major Bruce Shand, the bride's father, the man who had given Camilla away at the Guards' Chapel 20 years before, the man with 2 military crosses and a war behind wire, and in 1993, with his daughter's private life spread across every front page in the land, he decided that enough was finally enough. According to the accounts of biographers, and it must be held as reported rather than documented in a record, Bruce Shand confronted the Prince of Wales at a private gathering and reproached him directly, face to face, for what he had done to his daughter's life. He is said to have told the future king, in so many words, that he had ruined her. Sit with the courage of that, and then set it against the silence of the man Camilla had actually married. Here was her father, an old man now, a decorated hero of the Desert War, walking up to the heir to the throne in a private room and telling him to his face that he had wronged his child. It was a breach of every rule of deference the old world had lived by. One did not reproach the Prince of Wales. One did not say such things aloud. But Bruce Shand had spent his youth learning what honour demanded and what it cost. And when it came to his own daughter, he found he could not do what everyone around him was doing, which was to look away and say nothing. The father spoke. The husband did not. That contrast is the sharpest thing in the whole story, and it cuts both ways, which is exactly why it matters. On one reading, it shames Andrew. Here was a wound to Camilla so grave that her elderly father, a man of the old school if ever there was one, felt compelled to break the deepest taboo of his class and confront a prince over it. And her husband, the man who shared her name and her home and her bed, said nothing at all. Where the father found anger, the husband found only silence. To those inclined to think ill of Andrew Parker Bowles, this is the proof of it, the moment that reveals him as a man too comfortable, too compromised, too busy protecting his own place to stand up for his own wife. But turn it over, and the same contrast can be read the other way. Bruce Shand was Camilla's father, and a father may rage on his child's behalf with clean hands. Andrew was her husband, and his hands were not clean, and he knew it. He had been unfaithful for the whole of the marriage. He had, by most accounts, known of and tolerated the affair for years. What standing did such a man have to storm up to the prince and demand satisfaction? To do so would have been not honour, but hypocrisy. A man conducting his own affairs, playing the outraged husband for the cameras. Perhaps his silence was not cowardice at all. Perhaps it was a kind of honesty, a recognition that he was in no position to throw stones, and that the most decent thing a compromised man can do is keep his mouth shut and spare everyone the spectacle of his outrage. The story will not settle which reading is true, and that refusal to settle is the heart of it. Whatever the truth of Andrew's silence, the affair moved that year toward its final and most public confirmation, and again, it was not Andrew who spoke, but the prince himself. On the 29th of June 1994, the television network carried a documentary made with the prince's cooperation, a long and searching film by Jonathan Dimbleby in which Charles submitted to questions about his life and his marriage. Some 13 million people were watching when the interviewer asked the prince directly whether he had been faithful to his wife. And the prince, after a lifetime of denial and discretion, admitted that he had not. He had tried to be faithful, he said, until the marriage had irretrievably broken down. The following day, his private secretary confirmed what everyone already knew, that the woman in question was Camilla Parker Bowles. The heir to the throne had confessed his adultery with Andrew's wife to 13 million of his future subjects. Consider that number against the silence of the husband. 13 million people, in a single evening, heard the Prince of Wales acknowledge the affair that had defined and destroyed the Parker Bowles marriage. And the man most directly wronged by that affair, the husband, contributed not one word to the national conversation about it, not that night, and not in the weeks that followed. Everyone else in this drama had now spoken. The princess had spoken through her book. The prince had spoken on television. The father had spoken to the prince's face. The tapes had spoken for the lovers whether they wished it or not. Only Andrew, at the very centre of the wreckage, kept his silence intact, whole, unbroken, a stillness at the heart of the noise that no one could quite explain. The documentary that finished the concealment was itself a landmark, a thing without real precedent in the history of the monarchy. For the heir to the throne to sit before a camera and answer questions about the intimate failures of his marriage was extraordinary, an act of exposure that even a decade earlier would have been unthinkable. When Charles admitted, in that careful phrase, that he had been unfaithful only after the marriage had irretrievably broken down, he was speaking to a national audience of some 13 million people, and he was confirming, from his own mouth, the thing the tapes and the books had only alleged. The woman was named the next day by his own office. There could be no more doubt, no more deniability, no more shelter in the possibility that it was all press invention. The prince had told the country himself, and still the contrast held, sharper than ever. The prince had spoken, at length and on camera. The princess had spoken, through her book, and soon in a famous interview of her own. The old father, Bruce Shand, had spoken his anger to the prince's face. Every principal in the drama had found a voice, except the one man whose grievance was, on paper, the plainest of all. Andrew Parker Bowles, the husband, said nothing, in the year of the confession, as in every year before it. Whether that silence was the noblest thing in the whole affair, or merely the most convenient, it was, by now, unmistakably the most consistent. He had said nothing at the start, and he would say nothing at the end, and the sheer steadiness of it was becoming, against all odds, the thing people remembered him for. The comparison between the father and the husband is worth holding a moment longer, because it is the moral hinge of the whole story, and it genuinely cuts both ways. Bruce Shand spoke because he was a father, and a father may burn with a clean and simple anger on his child's behalf. Andrew stayed silent because he was a husband, and his hands were not clean, and some part of him surely knew it. To have played the outraged spouse after his own years of straying and his own long tolerance of the affair would have been a performance, and a dishonest one. Perhaps then his silence was not the failure of nerve it can appear to be, but a rough kind of honesty. The honesty of a man who understands that he is in no position to demand satisfaction, and who chooses to spare everyone the spectacle of a hypocrite's rage. The story will not decide it for us. It only lays the father and the husband side by side, and lets the silence between them speak. By the middle of 1994, then, there was nothing left to hide and nothing left to protect. The affair was confirmed from the prince's own mouth. The marriage of Charles and Diana was over in fact, if not yet in law, and the marriage of Andrew and Camilla, that long accommodation built entirely on discretion, had no reason left to exist, because there was no longer any secret for the discretion to guard. All that remained was the paperwork, the formal untangling of a marriage that had died years before in everything but name. It would come the following year, and when it came, it would be, like the man himself, quiet, careful, and almost entirely without a raised voice. After all the noise, the ending would arrive in a whisper. Chapter 12. A divorce in a single paragraph. When the marriage of Andrew and Camilla Parker Bowles finally ended, it ended not in a courtroom brawl or a bitter public reckoning, but in a few careful, bloodless lines, a joint statement so restrained that it might have been describing the dissolution of a business partnership rather than the last act of the most talked-about private drama in Britain. There were no accusations. There was no blame. There was, above all, no mention of the prince whose shadow had lain across the whole thing for 15 years. In its very refusal to say anything, the statement was the purest expression of the man at the centre of it. Even in ending, Andrew Parker Bowles said as close to nothing as a divorcing husband can. The ground had been prepared quietly. In 1994, Andrew retired from the army, closing out a career of 34 years that had carried him from a young officer of the Blues to a brigadier and director of the Royal Army Veterinary Corps, with an appointment as Silver Stick to the Queen and a commendation for bravery along the way. He left the service with his honours intact and his reputation remarkably undamaged, a man who had somehow walked through the most humiliating public scandal of the decade without a stain on his own name. And then, with the soldiering done, he and Camilla moved to end the marriage that had been a marriage in name only for years. In January of 1995, the announcement came. The couple issued a jointly agreed statement, and its wording is the closest thing to a personal testimony that Andrew Parker Bowles ever gave about the whole affair, which is why it deserves to be quoted with care. Throughout their marriage, they said, they had always tended to follow rather different interests, and in recent years they had led completely separate lives. They had grown apart, the statement went on, to such an extent that, with the exception of their children and a lasting friendship, there was little of common interest between them. That was all. No prince, no tape, no blame. A marriage of 22 years, dissolved in the language of two civilized people who had simply drifted, with a lasting friendship carefully noted at the close. It was, of course, a fiction, or at least a very great simplification, and everyone reading it knew as much. The marriage had not quietly drifted apart over differing interests. It had been overtaken by one of the most famous love affairs of the age, dragged through the newspapers, exposed on tape, confirmed on television. But the statement's refusal to say any of that was not really a lie. It was a courtesy, a final act of the discretion that had governed the whole marriage, a decision by both of them to let the thing end with dignity rather than with a settling of scores. The couple had already lived apart for 2 years. The divorce was granted on the ground of that separation, no fault attached to either side, and the decree was made absolute in the early spring of 1995. After 22 years, it was over, and it was over quietly. The establishment, watching, breathed out. One royal courtier, Lord Charteris, caught the mood in a single dry line that said more than the couple's whole statement. The divorce, he observed, would clear the air. And yes, of course, he added, the prince would still be king. There it was, the establishment's real concern laid bare in a sentence. The Parker Bowles divorce was welcome because it tidied things up, because it removed an awkward complication, because it let the machinery of monarchy roll on toward the succession without a married mistress cluttering the path. The human cost of it, the ending of a family, the 2 grown children watching their parents part, mattered less to that cold official mind than the smoothness of the road ahead. The marriage was cleared away like a fallen branch after a storm, so that the important traffic could pass. And what of Andrew in that moment, at the formal end of it all? He was, by the reckoning of the world, the loser of the whole story. He had married the woman who wanted him and lost her to the future king. He had been humiliated in the most public way a husband can be. And now, at the age of 55, he was divorced, his marriage a national talking point, his private wound a matter of record. Yet he emerged from it with the one thing he had never surrendered, his dignity, and he had kept it by the only means he had ever trusted. He had said nothing. Through the book and the tapes and the television confession and the divorce itself, he had refused, again and again, to make himself the story. And in that refusal, strange to say, lay the beginning of his rescue, because a man who never complains is a man very hard to pity for long, and a man very hard to pity is a man who can, in time, be admired. It is worth pausing on the career he carried, undamaged, out of the wreckage, because it is a measure of how completely he had kept the 2 halves of his life apart. He had served for 34 years. He had commanded the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment and directed the Royal Army Veterinary Corps. He had been made an officer of the Order of the British Empire, had held the ceremonial office of Silver Stick to the Queen, had been commended for bravery for dangerous work in Rhodesia at the birth of Zimbabwe. He retired a brigadier with every honour intact, in the same stretch of years that saw his private life turned inside out on the front pages. That a man could be so publicly humiliated in one half of his existence, while the other half proceeded, unblemished, to an honourable retirement, tells you how rigidly he had walled the soldier off from the husband, and how much the establishment was willing to protect one of its own who behaved, throughout, exactly as it wished him to. The statement that ended the marriage was, in that light, entirely characteristic. It gave the press nothing to feed on, no blame to apportion, no fresh wound to photograph. It spoke of separate interests and separate lives and a lasting friendship, and it left the prince, whose shadow had lain over the whole thing, entirely unmentioned. It was, in its way, a final gift to everyone, to Camilla, to the children, to the monarchy, and not least to Andrew's own dignity. A decision to let the marriage die in language so calm that it could give no satisfaction to anyone hungry for a scene. He had married in the grandest possible manner, before 800 guests and the mother of the Queen. He divorced in a handful of bloodless lines. Between the two lay a whole life of learning to say as little as possible, and the divorce statement was its masterpiece. And yet, for all its dignity, there was something the statement quietly bought him that ought not to be passed over. By refusing to blame, he ensured that no one could blame him. By naming no prince, he kept the friendship of the palace intact. By ending the marriage in the language of two reasonable adults who had simply grown apart, he stepped out of the wreckage with his honour polished rather than tarnished, the rare divorced man of a great scandal whom nobody thought the worse of. Whether he intended all of that, or whether it was simply the natural expression of his character, hardly matters. The effect was the same. The most restrained possible ending was also, as it happened, the ending that served Andrew Parker Bowles best, and that quiet coincidence of virtue and advantage is the pattern of his entire life in miniature. The quiet ending of the marriage was, in truth, not an ending at all, but a hinge. Everyone assumed that the divorce would be the last the world heard of Andrew Parker Bowles, that he would fade into the wounded obscurity such men usually inhabit, the discarded first husband, the answer to a trivia question. He did the opposite. What came after the divorce would be, in its own understated way, the most surprising part of the whole story. The second act of a man everyone had written off, in which the loser of the great royal scandal quietly became something almost nobody could have predicted. He had lost the marriage. He had kept his silence. And he was, at 55, about to begin again. Chapter 13. The second act nobody expected. A bitter man would have sold his story, and Andrew Parker Bowles did the opposite. In the year after the divorce, in 1996, he married again, and the marriage was, by every account, a genuinely happy one. His second wife was Rosemary Pittman, a woman he had known for years, born Rosemary Dickinson in 1940, who had been married before to another army officer and had raised 3 sons. She was warm and steady and much loved in their circle, and with her, Andrew found the settled contentment that had eluded the whole of his first marriage. The man the newspapers had cast as the great loser of the royal scandal simply walked out of the wreckage and built himself a new and quiet happiness, as though to demonstrate that the story the papers had told about him was not the whole of him at all. There is something quietly instructive in the speed and the calm of it. A man consumed by grievance does not remarry happily within a year. A man plotting revenge does not slip contentedly into a second marriage and a life of racing and country weekends. Andrew Parker Bowles, freed at last from the long, strange accommodation of his first marriage, seemed almost relieved, and he poured himself into the ordinary pleasures he had always loved: the horses, the friends, the turf. He had lost a wife to a king, and gained, in her place, a peaceful home with a woman who wanted nothing from him but himself. For a man supposedly ruined, he looked remarkably like a man who had come out ahead. The happiness lasted the better part of 15 years, and then it was taken from him in the ordinary, cruel way. Rosemary fell ill with cancer, and on the 10th of January 2010 she died, aged 69. And here the story delivers one of its most extraordinary images, one that says more about the peculiar civilization of these people than any number of scandals could. When Rosemary died, the woman who had preceded her, Camilla, was reported to be deeply saddened, and she attended a memorial service for her at the Guards' Chapel in London that March, the same Guards' Chapel where Andrew had married her 37 years before. And at Rosemary's funeral, at a Catholic church in Malmesbury. Among the mourners was Princess Anne, the woman Andrew had courted 40 years earlier, before any of it began. Stop and consider that gathering. The first wife, now the mistress of the future king, grieving the second wife. The old flame, the Queen's own daughter, standing at the graveside of the woman who had married the man she herself had once been linked with. These were people who had every reason, by the ordinary arithmetic of jealousy and hurt, to have cut one another off entirely, and instead they came together to mourn. It is a picture of a world in which the bonds of friendship and long acquaintance ran deeper than the wounds, in which people who had tangled one another's lives into knots still turned up for one another when it mattered. And at the centre of that picture stood Andrew, a widower now, mourning a wife the whole of his strange extended family had gathered to honour. It would have been understandable at that point for the story to end in sadness, an old man twice bereaved of the settled happiness he had found late. But even in grief, Andrew Parker Bowles carried the same quality that had defined him throughout, the refusal to make himself a spectacle. He mourned Rosemary privately and with dignity. He did not use his loss any more than he had used his humiliation as an occasion for public feeling. He simply absorbed it, as he had absorbed everything, and went on. The silence that had looked, during the scandal, like either strength or complicity, now looked simply like character, the settled habit of a man who had decided long ago that his inner life was his own and would not be handed to strangers. The marriage to Rosemary deserves more than a passing mention, because it is the clearest evidence the story offers about the kind of man Andrew Parker Bowles actually was underneath the scandal. He had known her for years before they wed. She was not a trophy or a rebound, but a settled and suitable companion, a woman of his own world who had raised her own family and understood his. Together, they lived the life he had always most enjoyed, the country life of horses and friends and long, unhurried days, and those who knew them described a genuinely contented household. A man does not build such a thing out of bitterness. The very ease of his second marriage was a quiet rebuke to everyone who had cast him only as the wounded party of the first, proof that the great scandal, whatever it had cost him, had not hollowed him out or soured him or left him nursing a grievance he could not put down. The world around that marriage, meanwhile, was being reshaped by a single catastrophe. In the summer of 1997, Diana died in a car crash in Paris, and the shock of it rearranged every feeling the country held about the whole long saga. The woman who had been the wronged wife of the story became, in death, a kind of secular saint, and for a time the anger against Charles and Camilla burned hotter than ever. It would take years for the public mood to soften, years of patient and careful rehabilitation before Camilla could be accepted at the prince's side. Through all of it, Andrew stayed exactly where he had always been, off to the side, silent, getting on with his own life, neither profiting from the tragedy nor commenting on it. The one figure in the drama who never seemed to want anything from the public at all. There is a particular poignancy in the timing of it all, the way his private happiness and the nation's grief ran side by side. In the years Andrew was quietly building a contented second marriage in the Wiltshire countryside, the public story he had been dragged into was passing through its darkest chapter, the death of the young woman who had been its wronged wife, and the long, cold anger that followed. He had no part in any of that. He was simply a man who had found peace and was living it, off to one side of a national drama that no longer needed him, asking nothing of anyone. In a saga full of people who wanted something from the public, sympathy or forgiveness or vindication, he stands out as the one who wanted only to be left alone with his horses and his wife, and who was, at last, more or less granted it. By the time of Rosemary's death, something had shifted in the way the country saw the whole cast of the old drama, Andrew included. The rawness of the early 1990s had faded. The prince and Camilla were together in the open now. Diana had died in Paris in 1997, and the shock of that had rearranged every feeling the public held about the entire story. And Andrew, the quiet man who had never sold a word, had begun, almost without anyone noticing, to be regarded not as a figure of pity, but as a figure of a certain understated respect, the one person in the whole business who had conducted himself, from beginning to end, with restraint. He had lost a wife and gained a widowerhood, but he had never once lost his dignity, and in the long run, that turned out to matter more than anyone in 1993 could have guessed. Chapter 14. Friends of the Man Who Took His Wife. In the spring of 2005, Andrew Parker Bowles did something that ought to have been impossible. He attended, as a guest, the wedding of the man who had spent the whole of Andrew's own marriage in love with Andrew's own wife. On the 9th of April 2005, Charles, Prince of Wales, married Camilla Parker Bowles in a civil ceremony at the Guildhall in Windsor, making lawful at last the relationship that had cost so many people so much. And there, among the guests, at ease and untroubled, was Andrew, the first husband, with his own second wife Rosemary at his side. The wronged man had come to watch the wedding of the woman he had lost to the man who had taken her, and he had come not as a ghost at the feast, but as a friend. To understand how that was possible, you have to understand something particular about the world these people came from. A capacity for a kind of civilized forgetting that can look, to outsiders, almost inhuman. In that world, one did not carry grudges into permanence. One did not let the wreckage of the past poison the arrangements of the present. Life was long, the circle was small, and everyone would go on meeting everyone else at the races and the funerals and the weddings for the rest of their days. And so a way had to be found to be civil, to be more than civil, to be genuinely friendly across the deepest wounds. Andrew Parker Bowles was a master of that art, perhaps its supreme practitioner, and his presence at the 2005 wedding was its finest demonstration. The friendships, remarkably, had never really been broken. Through all of it, the scandal and the tapes and the divorce, Andrew and Charles had remained on cordial terms, two men who hunted the same country and knew the same people, and had, in their strange way, shared a life. Andrew had never made an enemy of the prince, never denounced him, never demanded that the circle choose between them. And so when the prince finally married Camilla, there was no awkwardness to overcome, no breach to repair, because Andrew had never allowed a breach to open in the first place. His silence, all those years, had not only protected his own dignity, it had preserved the friendships that let him sit, comfortably, at that wedding, a welcome guest rather than a bitter absence. There is a phrase the newspapers reached for, years later, to describe the relationship between Andrew and the couple, and it captures the strange warmth of it exactly. Friendly exes, one report called them, the friendliest. It sounds glib, but it points at something real and rather remarkable. These were people who had every conventional reason for lifelong hostility and who had chosen, instead, a durable and genuine friendship. The man whose wife had been taken and the man who had taken her were, by the reckoning of everyone who knew them, actually fond of one another. It is not the way such stories are supposed to go. It is not the way most people, wronged as Andrew was wronged, would have been able to play it. But it was the way he chose, and the choosing was of a piece with everything else about him. It would be too simple, and untrue to the man, to paint this only as saintly forgiveness. Andrew had his own reasons to keep the peace, and they were not all noble. He had been unfaithful himself, and a man who has strayed is slow to condemn straying. He had, by most accounts, tolerated the affair for years, and a man who tolerated it can hardly stage a grand estrangement over it later. And there was the plain matter of his own comfort and standing, all of which depended on remaining inside the circle rather than outside it in wounded exile. His graciousness was real, but it was also, at least in part, in his interest. The story does not require him to be a saint. It only requires him to be understood. A man whose good behavior and whose self-interest happened, conveniently, to point in the same direction for the whole of his life. The wedding of 2005 was itself a careful and understated affair, a world away from the vast spectacle of 1981, and its very modesty was part of the long project of making the once impossible acceptable. There was no great cathedral, no global audience of hundreds of millions, only a civil ceremony at the Guildhall in Windsor, followed by a blessing, a marriage arranged to draw as little heat as possible after decades of scandal. That Andrew was among the guests, easy and untroubled with his own wife at his side, sent its own quiet message to the watching country, that the first husband bore no grudge, that the whole tangled business had resolved itself into something civilized, that everyone had, in the end, behaved rather well. His presence was a kind of blessing of its own, the wronged man's public forgiveness, and it helped, in its small way, to smooth the couple's path back toward respectability. There is a particular genius in the English upper class for this sort of thing, for absorbing even the deepest wounds into the ongoing courtesies of a shared life, and Andrew Parker Bowles embodied it completely. In that world, one did not burn bridges, because one would need to cross them again at the next funeral, the next wedding, the next meet of the hunt. The circle was too small and life too long for permanent enmity. So the man whose wife had been taken and the man who had taken her went on meeting year after year at the races and the great occasions with perfect civility and even real warmth, and nobody who watched them together could have guessed at the wound that lay beneath the friendship. It was a triumph of manners over feeling, and Andrew was its supreme practitioner. It would be wrong, though, to make the whole thing sound merely graceful, as if no cost had ever been paid. Somewhere beneath the perfect manners, there was a man who had loved a woman, married her, given her children, and lost her by slow degrees to a friend, and who had then sat, smiling, at that friend's wedding to her. Whatever peace he had made with it, the loss was real, and the grace with which he carried it was not the absence of pain, but the mastery of it. That is perhaps the truest thing that can be said of Andrew Parker Bowles in these years. He had not been spared the wound. He had simply refused, with a discipline that never once faltered, to let anyone see it bleed. The friendliest of exes was also, if you looked closely, a man who had learned to hold a great deal behind a level and pleasant face. Still, when the tally is made, the fact remains that he did it. Whatever the mixture of grace and calculation behind it, Andrew Parker Bowles stood in that room in Windsor in 2005 and wished the couple well, and meant it, and went home to his own happy second marriage. Very few people, handed the life he had been handed, could have done the same. The capacity to be genuinely glad, or at least genuinely gracious, at the triumph of the two people who had cost you the most, is rare in any walk of life. He had it, whether from breeding or temperament or long practice at swallowing his own feelings, and it carried him through what should have been the most excruciating afternoon of his life, as though it were nothing at all. He said nothing bitter. He never did. Chapter 15. The Brigadier on the Wall. In a London studio, in the early years of the new century, One of the greatest painters of the age spent the better part of a year turning Andrew Parker Bowles into a 7-foot masterpiece, and the result now hangs among the most valuable British portraits ever made. The painter was Lucian Freud, the most celebrated and unforgiving portraitist in the world, a man who saw straight through his sitters and put what he saw mercilessly onto the canvas. And the sitter, across the many long mornings the work required, was Andrew, dressed in the full uniform of the household cavalry, the same kind of uniform he had worn on his wedding day and through the whole of his soldiering life. Freud called the painting simply the Brigadier. There is a deep irony in that portrait, and it is worth drawing out because it gathers the whole of Andrew's story into a single image. Here was a man whose most famous role in the national imagination was as the wronged husband, the cuckold, the loser of the great royal scandal. And here he was, at the same time, chosen by the finest painter alive as a subject worthy of a monumental canvas, rendered not as a victim, but as a figure of substance and gravity, a soldier in his regalia, filling a picture some 7 feet high. The uniform that had been the emblem of his rise now became the emblem of his endurance. Freud saw in him not the punchline the tabloids had made of him, but a real and weighty human presence, and he fixed that presence on the canvas for good. The scale of what that painting became is its own kind of scale paragraph. The Brigadier was finished around 2004. It hung, over the years, in major exhibitions of Freud's work. And in November of 2015, at Christie's in New York, it was sold at auction for $34.89 million, one of the highest prices ever paid for a Freud, placing the likeness of Andrew Parker Bowles among the most valuable British portraits of the modern age. Set that number beside the story. The man the newspapers had pitied and mocked in 1993 was, 20 years later, the subject of a painting worth the better part of $40 million. The uniform had outlasted the humiliation. The image of the man had become worth a fortune, even as the man himself went quietly on with his life. And go quietly on he did. In the years after the scandal and the divorce, Andrew Parker Bowles resumed exactly the life he had always loved, the life of the English country gentleman and the turf. He was a familiar and respected figure at the races, at Royal Ascot, in the world of horses and hounds that had shaped him from boyhood. He held his honours and his friendships. He was godfather still to Princess Anne's daughter, close as ever to the old flame of his youth. He had grandchildren through Tom and Laura. He had, in every visible respect, the settled and contented late life of a man entirely at peace with himself, whatever storms had passed over him. The wound the country had watched in 1993 had healed over so completely that it was hard, looking at him now, to believe it had ever been there. Even in his 9th decade, the man kept his capacity to surprise, and to do it without ever raising his voice. In late 2023, it emerged that Andrew Parker Bowles, then in his 80s, was in a relationship with the broadcaster Anne Robinson, the famously sharp-tongued television presenter, a pairing that delighted the newspapers and confirmed that the old cavalry charm had not deserted him even now. It was reported, gently, as the late romance of a man who had always been good company, and it fit the pattern of a life that had, again and again, refused to end in the sadness that the world kept predicting for it. He was not a broken man. He had never been a broken man. He was simply a private one. And the difference between those two things was the whole misunderstanding at the heart of his public story. The making of the Freud portrait is a story in itself, and it says something about the man that he agreed to it at all. Lucian Freud did not flatter his sitters. He required them to come to his studio again and again over many months, and to sit in the harsh light of his unsparing gaze while he set down every line and every truth of the face. For a man whose private life had already been exposed to the whole nation, to submit to that kind of scrutiny, in a great uniform that could not help but recall everything he had been and lost, took a certain nerve. But Andrew sat, morning after morning, in the full dress of the household cavalry, and let the painter make of him what he would. What Freud made was not a punchline, but a monument, a vast and dignified image of a soldier of real substance, the very opposite of the figure the tabloids had reduced him to. And in the ordinary course of his life, away from the canvas, he simply carried on being the man he had always been. He was a fixture of the racing world he had loved since boyhood, a familiar figure in the enclosures at Ascot, respected among the horsemen and the old families as one of their own. He kept his place in the circle and his closeness to Princess Anne, the flame of his youth, whose daughter he had stood godfather to. He grew old, surrounded by the things and the people he cared for, and he did it without complaint and without display. A man who had been through the fire of the most public scandal of the age and come out the other side with his pleasures and his friendships and his dignity all intact. The refusal to write is worth dwelling on, because in an age when everyone tells everything, it is almost incomprehensible. A memoir by Andrew Parker Bowles would have been one of the publishing events of its decade. His was the one account of the whole affair that had never been given, the view from the position everyone was most curious about, and the price offered for it would have been enormous. He had, in his silence, a fortune and a vindication both, sitting there for the taking, needing only that he break the habit of a lifetime and speak. He never did. He carried the one story only he could tell to the very edge of old age and kept it there, unwritten, unsold, unspoken, the way he had kept everything. And in the keeping he turned a private stubbornness into something that began, at last, to look like a kind of grandeur. Through all of it, across the whole long second act, one thing never changed. He never spoke. He never wrote the memoir that publishers would have paid a fortune for. He never gave the interview that would have set the record straight, or settled the score, or told the world at last how it had really felt to be the man he had been. The one document he might have left, the account only he could give, he took with him, unwritten, into old age. Everyone else had spoken. The princess through her book, the prince on his television, the tapes for the lovers, the father to the prince's face. Only Andrew, offered every platform a man could want, kept his silence whole to the end. And that silence, which had once looked like weakness, had hardened over the decades into something that looked a great deal like the last dignity left standing in the whole affair. Chapter 16. The verdict he never gave. On the day his former wife was crowned, the one man who could have destroyed the story chose once more to say nothing. On the 6th of May, 2023, in Westminster Abbey, Charles was crowned king, and Camilla was crowned queen beside him. And among the congregation, in mourning dress, sat Andrew Parker Bowles, 83 years old, with the two children he and Camilla had made together somewhere near him in the great church. He had married her half a century before, in another chapel, with the household cavalry lining the aisle. Now he watched her receive a crown from the hands of the man he had lost her to, and he did what he had always done. He watched, and he was gracious, and he said nothing at all. Return, for a moment, to the deepest root of the whole thing, because it closes a circle that runs back more than a century. Camilla, the woman being crowned, was the great-granddaughter of Alice Keppel, who had been the mistress of King Edward VII at the turn of the 20th century. What the country was witnessing in that abbey was, in a sense, an old Edwardian arrangement brought at last into the daylight and made lawful the descendant of a royal mistress crowned as a royal wife. The pattern that Camilla is said to have joked about at her very first meeting with Charles all those years before had come full circle, and Andrew Parker Bowles, the man who had married into that ancient pattern and been broken open by it, sat and watched the whole long story reach its improbable, sanctified conclusion. His silence by now had lasted 30 years, and the question it poses has never been answered, because he never answered it. Was Andrew Parker Bowles a man of honour, who bore an unbearable humiliation with a dignity almost no one else could have managed, and who protected his wife, his children, his friends, and the monarchy itself by refusing, ever, to make the wound public? Or was he a man of convenience, who stayed silent because he had too much to lose by speaking, who tolerated the affair because he was busy with affairs of his own, who kept his honours and his place and his friendships by the simple expedient of never rocking a boat that was carrying him comfortably along? The evidence, honestly weighed, points both ways at once, and it always will. He was almost certainly both, in proportions that only he could have known, and he took the reckoning with him. And here is the deepest and most uncomfortable truth the story leaves behind. The country chose. Faced with a man who might have been a wronged hero or a willing accomplice, the establishment, the press, and in the end, the public settled, quietly, on the flattering reading. They decided to remember him as the gentleman, the good soldier who bore it all in silence, and they rewarded that reading with a seat in the abbey at the coronation of the very people who had wronged him. Perhaps he earned it. Perhaps his silence was exactly the noble thing they took it for. Or perhaps the monarchy simply needed the story to have a dignified ending, needed the first husband to be a good sport rather than a bitter ghost, and so agreed, collectively, to cast him as the gentleman because the alternative was too awkward to look at. A tidy ending served everyone, and Andrew Parker Bowles, who had spent his whole life understanding exactly how that world worked, let them have it. When the couple themselves had described the end of their marriage, back in 1995, they had reached, in that careful joint statement, for one particular phrase to carry the whole of what remained between them. With the exception of their children, they said, and a lasting friendship, there was little of common interest left. A lasting friendship. Those were the words they chose, and against every expectation the words turned out to be true. The friendship did last, through the scandal and the divorce and the second marriage and the widowerhood, all the way to a coronation, where the first husband sat in honoured silence and watched his old friend become a queen. Whatever else was false in that statement, that phrase held, and it may be the truest thing anyone in the whole story ever said. There is a way of reading the whole of his silence that is worth laying out in full, because it is the most generous reading, and it may also be the truest. Consider everything his silence protected. It protected Camilla, sparing her the spectacle of a bitter former husband adding his voice to the chorus against her. It protected his own children, Tom and Laura, who had to grow up with their family's most intimate business spread across the newspapers and did not need their father turning it into a public feud. It protected the monarchy, whose survival depended on the story finding, eventually, a dignified resolution. And it protected something in himself, a private core that he refused, to the very end, to sell or surrender to strangers. A man who says nothing across 30 years of provocation is either the emptiest man alive or one of the most disciplined. And everything else about Andrew Parker Bowles suggests the latter, a will of iron beneath the easy charm, a decision made early and kept without a single lapse. And yet the harder reading will not quite go away, because his silence cost him nothing and won him everything. And a virtue that is also an advantage is a virtue we are right to hold up to the light. He kept his honours by never embarrassing the crown. He kept his friendships by never forcing anyone to choose. He kept his comfortable place in the only world he had ever known by never once disturbing it. The gentleman and the man of convenience wore, in his case, exactly the same face, and did exactly the same thing, which was nothing. And that is precisely why the question of which one he truly was can never be closed. Even the great pattern of it, the descendant of a royal mistress crowned at last as a royal wife, resolved every thread of the story but one. It could not resolve him. Weigh it however you like, and the scales will not come to rest. Set his silence against Bruce Shand's single brave outburst, and it can look like weakness, or worse. Set it against the endless noise of everyone else, the books and the tapes and the televised confessions, and it looks like the last dignity left in the room. Both readings survive every fact the record can offer, and that is not a failure of the telling, but the whole point of it. Andrew Parker Bowles built his life so that the truth of him could never quite be pinned down, and he succeeded so completely that not even the coronation, the grand public resolution of everyone else's story, could resolve his. The crown came down on the woman he had loved and lost. The verdict on the man who had let her go stayed exactly where he had always kept it, out of reach. So picture him one last time, the way the story began. An old man in mourning dress in the great grey abbey, watching the crown come down. 50 years earlier, he had been the brightest thing in every room, the dashing officer who had ridden at Aintree, the man every mother wanted, standing in his shining breastplate on the steps of the guards' chapel with the whole of his gilded world before him. He had lost, along the way, almost everything the newspapers thought a man should mind losing, and he had kept, through all of it, the one thing they never understood he was guarding, which was the right to keep his own counsel. The world had waited 30 years for him to speak. He never did. And in the end, his silence was not the absence of a verdict. It was the verdict. He looked at all of it, the whole long ruin and the whole long grace of it, and he decided, as he had decided every single time before, that some things a man keeps to himself. He said nothing. He simply watched the crown come down and smiled and let the story keep its secret, which was him. If a single life can hold that many contradictions and still keep its dignity, then it is worth deciding for yourself what to make of him. So tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and whether you think Andrew Parker Bowles was a man of honour who kept his mouth shut, or a man of convenience who simply had too much to lose. Subscribe if you would, so the next of these stories finds you, and share this one with anyone who still believes the quiet one in the corner has nothing to hide.